Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Mr. Spencer here, as well as myself, Brad. And today we're going to answer an interesting question, which is when should you not do a pen test, right? So what are your kind of thoughts, right? Kind of weird coming from a pen test group, right? And a podcast that's made by pen testers. Like, no, stop doing pen testing. You're doing it all wrong.
Yep.
So what is your thought process for putting this episode together? I'm very interested in
Yeah. So the idea behind this was how are all the ways? So when we do a pen test, there's a lot of situations where we'll talk to a client, and whether it might be in the pre-engagement discussions of like, hey, we're thinking about doing X, Y, and Z. What do you think? Here's what we're looking for. And we'll give them advice. And many times they will, say we want a red team. And then we ask them questions and kind of dig deeper into it. And we say, okay, have you done vulnerability assessments? Have you done a pen test before? And some of those answers to those questions will be no. And so some of these, the topic of this podcast comes up from the kind of the pre-engagement discussions. And then also when we're doing the pen tests, a lot of times maybe we don't have that information up front right away. And then we get into an environment and it's pretty bad, right? Like there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of things that they probably could have done first that they didn't necessarily need us for. And that's really the goal of this episode is we would love to do a pen test for you. We'd love to take your money and like do all the fun offensive security things. But I'm a big believer that we should provide value above and beyond what we charge for it. And one of those things, one of those areas we see where organizations can kind of do some things themselves that they don't necessarily need us for is where this conversation kind of fits in. So the first kind of discussion point is compliance-oriented testing versus, testing for being proactive. And I think many organizations, right, wrong, or indifferent, just seek out security testing for compliance reasons, right? Yeah. Insurance mandates it, or whatever regulatory body that they're governed by mandates it, PCI, HIPAA, et cetera, et cetera. So I first wanted to talk about, what are the different types of security assessments that you could possibly do, right? And then kind of talk through when you are maybe not ready to do a pen test and when you're ready to do a pen test. So what are some of the things that we could do or you could do at your organization before we get there that maybe we would do anyways, but you could kind of do yourself, so to speak, to get you ready for that pen test so that when we do a pen test, we're finding the things that are more aligned with our expertise, right? They're deeper things, they're chained vulnerabilities, they're things that you wouldn't necessarily find without the kind of the time and the expertise in doing pen testing like we do. So that's kind of the premise of this episode. Hopefully that made sense.
No, I think it does. I think a lot of people, well, first of all, I'm going to say this, right? A pen test is a test that you study for. You should be preparing for a penetration test. Also, the other, not popular thing I'm going to say is a pen test is not designed to find vulnerabilities. That's not the goal, right? The goal is to view your stack from a threat actor perspective. And like you said, perform more advanced techniques, and reflect what a real bad guy would do. If we are spending all of our time documenting SSL vulnerabilities and default printer accounts in an environment, that's taking time away from us looking in that environment from that perspective, from the perspective of the nation state threat actor. And I think that's lost on a lot of people, right? Until we start having that conversation. One of the things that we see all the time with externals is like, they're like, well, you guys can just like use OSINT to figure out what our footprint is. And I'm like, we could, but is that what you want to pay me to do? Do you want to pay me to figure out how good my team is at finding your stuff? Because we're going to find it, but that time could be better spent doing other things. So I think I just like jumped all over the place there, but those are the three, the three most common issues I see where people are not prepared, do not understand. And you mentioned red team. I always go into those meetings, thinking, I don't think this is what they want, right? And how many times have they actually wanted a red team? Like once ever?
Yep.
And the rest of the time it's a purple team or an internal or whatever.
Yep.
And so anyway,
Yeah, and the truth is, not every organization needs a pen test right away.
Yeah.
Right? I think pen testing is great for almost every organization, but it doesn't necessarily mean you need it right away. It doesn't necessarily mean you need it right now. And to your point, like you can go through the whole pen test, but for a number of reasons, if you would potentially not get value from it if you don't have bandwidth to remediate, if you don't have a team to help remediate. There's a lot of factors that would play into just wasting that money, right? And we don't want you to waste money. We want your money and your resources, because we know they're finite and limited, especially for smaller organizations, SMBs, and smaller IT teams. We know you have finite resources, so we want to make sure that if we are doing an engagement with you, it's going to be super valuable for you above and beyond what you paid for it. And you're going to walk away with tangible results from it and not just kind of a check the box thing. And that starts with, you might not need it right away.
Yep. So and I think you're going to get into this. Yeah. Okay. So you actually are. I see it in the show notes now. So, do you want to step through the security assessments just to kind of set that, base of knowledge? And then I think that's going to frame the rest of our conversation. So I'm really glad that you have that.
Yeah. So in thinking through this, I was like, okay, if you're not ready for a pen test, is there other assessments that you might be ready for, right? From a third party perspective. So I boiled it down into kind of like 5 categories of security assessments that an organization could do. So the first is, and I've kind of ordered this in terms of maturity of like where it would fit. So the very first one is compliance based, right? You want to know, like, are we PCI compliant? Are we HIPAA compliant? Maybe you want to review your security policies. Maybe you're preparing for SOC compliance, right? SOC 2. Those are compliance based assessments. Those have kind of discrete and kind of finite beginning and end, right? Like there are definitive guidelines, benchmarks, controls that need to be in place to satisfy those requirements, right? So if you have never done, let's say you're a credit card or you're a payment processor, right? And you haven't done a PCI audit, that would probably be a really good place to start, because that's going to be one of your biggest vulnerabilities, right? If an organization comes in or auditor comes in and says, like, show us your attestations, right? And you don't have, paper trails or documentation or audits to show for compliance, that could be a big problem. So I think most folks usually start at compliance-based testing. Mm-hmm. The problem is I think most folks kind of stop there or go very rarely go beyond that too much. So that's the first thing, is compliance-based testing.
Yeah. And that's probably, something we see a reasonable amount of, especially at the ISO group. And so, usually if we get involved in that, it's just because we're checking one of the boxes for the compliance assessment, for like an external pen test or something. But,
and it also doesn't mean that it's less valuable than any of the other assessments. Just because it's, kind of like a checklist thing doesn't necessarily mean that it's less valuable by any means. Like there's still obviously value in doing PCI assessments, HIPAA assessments, those kinds of things, security policy review, et cetera.
So on that subject, I get a lot of complaints from, pretty much everybody, that they hate compliance. Compliance doesn't equal security, et cetera, so on and so forth. I'm not disagreeing with those people. Yep. But what I will say is you're going to get out of it what you put into it. So if you approach a compliance from a checkbox list perspective, you're probably not getting any value. It's an annoying thing you have to do for your job, whatever. However, if you look at the spirit of these compliance requirements, they are rooted in security, right? And if you, instead of just doing the minimum you can do to check the box and move on and get through with the process, you actually dive down into what they're trying to accomplish, then I think there is value there, right? I just don't think people approach it from that mindset. And that could be an entire podcast all on its own. And for those of you, before you guys like hunt me down in public and hang me, I'm not a proponent of forcing compliance on people in that way. But I think it can be a tool, right?
Yep.
Yeah,
absolutely. And a lot of the compliance frameworks, HIPAA, PCI, SOC, they stem from NIST. Right. 853 is NIST's flagship, risk based framework. A lot of frameworks stem from that, and they are pared down and stripped down versions of NIST. Like the NIST CSF is a stripped down version of 853. CIS, like the 20 critical controls, all kind of originates from the larger body that is NIST, right? And that's the same can be said for a lot of the compliance standards. It's like the minimum needed to satisfy the requirement. Doesn't mean you should stop there, obviously. And to your point, digging into it and not being overly cynical and kind of seeing the good in it, for lack of a better word, is better than just, completely dismissing it and poo-pooing it. So
exactly. So
vulnerabilities.
That's going to say the next one is vulnerability-based assessments, right? We would probably very commonly call this like a vulnerability scan, which is part of a larger vulnerability management program. We have talked about this ad nauseum on the show, and again, it's not a pen test, right? But it's not supposed to be. It's not designed to be a pen test, and you can't be substituted. A pen test is not going to take the place of vulnerability assessment or vice versa. They are completely separate things with separate goals.
Yep.
And so, it's important, absolutely important. If you don't have a vulnerability management program in your organization, you are wrong. But it's its own thing.
Yep. And it looks different for different organizations. If you do in-house development, that might be dynamic application security testing, DAST or SAST.
Yep.
It might be integrating security testing or checks into your continuous delivery, continuous integration platforms, into your code repositories. So vulnerability management could look different depending on the organization, and that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
And it's usually followed by, or it's usually before, risk-based strategy. So many times organizations will do the compliance stuff, the vulnerability stuff, and then they'll get into kind of the bigger risk frameworks, right? Like the bigger projects. This would be where we would do like an IT security assessment or our flagship 360 assessment, right? When the ISO comes in, they look at the entire organization, they audit everything, they look at security controls, they look at people, like a process, kind of like soup to nuts. What does the security look like at the organization, the firm, et cetera? And these are often bigger lifts. These are bigger engagements, bigger assessments. These things are oftentimes tied to, business results or business impact, right? Where there might be some tangible dollars assigned to certain assets or certain outcomes. Like if we're down for 24 hours, how much money or how much revenue does that cost us, right?
Yes.
How can we directly tie that back to, this asset over here that we're trying to protect? Which gives us some idea of how much we should spend to protect it, right? Yes. Nobody wants to spend $1 million protecting something that is worth nothing, right? So that's where the risk-based kind of assessments come in. They look at business impact. They map to frameworks. It's much more strategic in nature. And for, you could argue risk-based should come first, but it really doesn't many times in many organizations. Yeah. This is just kind of from my perspective, how it sometimes looks.
Yeah. And I think, we're kind of creating these silos that we're putting these things in, and it's not always so definitive, exactly. Right? And so there is an overlap between risk-based assessments and vulnerability-based assessments. And so sometimes they rely on each other, where vulnerability data will feed into a risk-based assessment. And similar to the one we're going to talk about next, a threat-based approach. There's some risk aspect to that. There's some vulnerability aspect to that. And so for the sake of conversation, we can have these like very well-defined, edges, but the reality is often not, it's not that way. So,
yeah, exactly. It's just kind of like how my brain works to like put things in buckets to like conceptualize things like, okay, we have compliance-based, risk-based, threat-based. So I'm always thinking in frameworks or systems. So very much so. There is overlap and there's bleed, and you could be doing kind of threat-based assessments within a configuration review, which is what we'll talk about next. And so very much agreed. So threat-based is your pen testing, right? Like that's the fun stuff, the threat emulation, pen testing, purple teaming. I would also include incident response here. So digital forensics, incident response in this kind of threat-based kind of assessments that you could do. I guess incident response is not necessarily an assessment. So you could find another bucket for that maybe, but in my mind, it's like a threat oriented thing, right?
Yeah, we could force that into a bucket. It's fine. It's fine.
So, and it's security, and and everything fits into like a well-defined box, like you said. So my apologies if the analogies aren't coming through, but and then the last one is configuration or architecture based assessments.
Yeah.
So this would be like cloud configuration, cloud security review, or we're doing segmentation testing this week for a client. Could be an endpoint evaluation where you look at like the physical device and can it be tampered with kind of thing. So those are some of the other assessments that I think of when I think of, what are all the possible security assessments that we could do? Because I think framing it in this way helps us decide at what point of time are we ready for XYZ assessment, or is there another assessment that's going to provide us value, right? If I've done vulnerability management, I have a risk-based security program, and we've done all these assessments, what's next for me to do? These are some ideas of what you could do next or before you do a pen test.
Yeah, completely agree. I think you could make the argument that nearly every one of these should be before a pen test. And we like to tell people that the pen test is the final exam, right? And I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, right? A pen test is not designed to find vulnerabilities. Okay, well, Brad, what is it for? Well, it's for validating that your existing controls are working the way that you think they should work, and to find gaps in that. And so if you haven't done these other things, if you don't have vulnerability management programs and strategic risk-based decisions being made in your organization, you're not studying for the test, dude. And so, that's the kind of the point that we're trying to get across is I think, you really have to be mature to get there. So with that said, quick admin, I want to encourage everybody that's listening to leave a review for us. I think it really helps us out a lot, right? And we love the feedback. You guys have been amazing. All the platforms that we go back and we do all the analytics on, I think we're like 4.5 or 5 stars across all the platforms that people listen on. So you guys are already doing an amazing job. So if you haven't done that, do us a favor. It takes like half a second to just hit that button real quick. If you want to type out something, that'd be amazing too. But it really helps us out a lot. It actually moves us up in the algorithm if there are people actively engaging in that platform with the podcast. So super helpful there. All right. So back to the show. Spencer, why or when do I not want to do an external pen test, right? So we've kind of covered the required prerequisite knowledge to understand what we're going to talk about. Now, like to the crux of the issue, why are you trying to talk us out of a job?
So if you don't want to give us money for a pen test, these are some of the things you can do before that, right? So in thinking about this episode, again, I was thinking for each of the kind of the main offensive security engagements that we do, which is external pen testing, internal pen testing, web app pen testing. Mobile isn't included here, but you could include mobile, API testing. You could think of this as just pen testing in general. But I think there are some specifics for specific engagements that are maybe some prerequisites that you might want to do first. I'm the internal guy, so I have a lot to say about internal, and I have a lot of empathy for IT admins and things like that, of things you could probably do before you do an internal pen test. But to start with external, I think one of the things that we can probably unanimously agree on is you have to know where everything is.
Yeah.
Right? You should have a good handle on what is out there as best as you possibly can. And you should know if something goes wrong, how you can get to it and patch it, or how it can be updated, or how issues can be resolved. So, for example, many times we do a pen test for a law firm. That law firm outsources their website, right? It's a WordPress website. It's hosted by somebody else. It's outsourced. Some agency manages it all, right?
Yeah.
Maybe there are plugins, WordPress plugins that are vulnerable that would allow somebody to literally deface the website. That would be pretty bad from a PR perspective. We all agree like PR risk is still a risk, right? If somebody defaces a website, puts bad stuff on it, that, is an egg on face kind of moment for that organization, that firm. So you have to know, who do I need to contact? How do I get them to patch the vulnerability or update the software? Yeah. What do I tell them, right? when something, when I get a pen test report, what do I tell them? What information might they need? Those are the things you want to have lined up before you do the pen test. So you're not kind of scrambling, to fit in all this information, all this stuff in a retesting window. It's really designed to just click a button and update the thing, right?
Yep.
And a lot of times we're helping organizations work through that of like who to contact, what to say, what information do they need, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a big one, I think, is just asset inventory and know how to handle the patching process.
Dude, I can't tell you how often we deliver a pen test report and we get and you've been in these meetings with us a million times, right? And we was like, hey, dude, your WordPress version is 3 years old, and you've got 11 instances of cross-site scripting because of jQuery or whatever it is, and you're like, oh yeah, no, marketing stood that site up. We have no idea like who the vendor is or how to contact them, and I'm like, cool. So we're missing like literal fundamental number one, which is asset management and vulnerability scanning. So yes, I agree with you. I think I'm glad it's the first bullet because it is probably the most common issue that we run into on external pen tests, where people are like, oh no, my thing that I wasn't looking at is suddenly vulnerable and I don't even know who to call. And then, it is frustrating. But not for us. We're like, cool, dude, sorry.
Yep.
It's frustrating for them, right? And so they're not setting themselves up for success.
Yep. The next one is if you've never done vulnerability scanning or vulnerability assessments. Now, this can be kind of parallel to internal pen testing and web app testing, right? For web app testing, if you've never tested your application code before with a security testing product like DAST, SaaS testing, or DAST or DAST, I guess testing is in the name, so you don't have to say testing twice.
I do it anyway. It's fine.
But it seems weird just to say DAST because it's like DAST testing. I just one of those things. Yeah. But anyways, I think vulnerability assessment is kind of like a critical component. And you mentioned earlier, it'd be much better if we could focus on the true risk or the things that we need to dive deeper into than just the simple stuff that is typically found by vulnerability scanning. And we say that a lot of internals too, where there's a lot of hygiene items that are not necessarily exploitable by themselves, but they are what you would consider a vulnerability, right? So the spooler service is a good example on domain controllers. So on an internal pen test, I consider the spooler service on a domain controller a vulnerability. It allows for coerced authentication, but it can't be abused in and of itself. Right. It used to be, it was patched, but it used to be. So those are some of the things like the vulnerability stuff. You should have some sort of process to identify some of the low-hanging fruit. And it looks different for external versus internal versus web. But I think having some of those processes in place before you do a pen test will help, so you can tell the pen testers like, oh yeah, these vulnerability findings, we find them regularly often. You don't necessarily have to focus on those too much. Let's work on the more in-depth stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that's it in a nutshell, right? I don't have anything to add. Like, you should be doing vulnerability management and vulnerability scanning. And it's in every one of these. So like, as we get through the different types of pen testing, it's like, oh, by the way, are you doing vulnerability assessment?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm good with that. And then I think the follow on for that is, if you have no intentions of taking action on the report, and this goes for all forms of pen testing, or if you are unable to take actions on the report, this isn't going to be a great experience for you, because you're going to eat these vulnerabilities, right? And what I mean by eat is accept them. Now you have knowledge of a problem in your environment, and there's nothing you can do about it, or you refuse to do anything about it. So, and I've heard you talk about this on the show before. You should have allocated time at the conclusion of the pen test to address the issues. It still happens to us where we'll deliver the report and they're like, well, we're really busy for the next 6 months on a major migration, and we're not even going to be able to look at this until 2028. And it's like, cool, so enjoy the report. And then we just, you know what I mean? And so don't get me wrong, man, I'm not picking on people for being busy, but like, you're paying a not small amount of money for this. And if you're not doing anything with it, you're wasting your money. So
yeah, it's something that I'm kind of constantly aware of in trying to iterate our reports on, and how we communicate these findings to better afford organizations the ability to remediate, or have the time to remediate. So I think it's something that, we are continuously trying to innovate on, of like, how do we get people to remediate these things? a lot of it is just time and resources, right? Like they don't have the bodies, they don't have the time, they're working on other projects, and that is very much out of our control.
Hmm.
And maybe if you're on an IT team, it's very much out of your control too. Like you have your priorities,
Yeah, of
know
course.
that you've been given, and if you don't get those done, then you run the risk of getting into trouble for not doing the things that you were told to do.
Hmm.
So definitely empathize in this situation. I think where we can help is by providing remediation guidance or providing as much information as we can in our reports to give the client enough information to go on in so that they can more accurately or quickly remediate those findings.
Yeah,
So I agree. Having a plan to remediate and kind of baking that into the engagement life cycle, so to speak, is a really important thing to consider before you get into the pen testing process.
Yeah, I agree. And a lot of these overlap, right? So like where
Mhm.
we talked about not having asset inventory or patch management, as we move into internal pen tests, the same thing applies, right? So
Yep.
if you don't plan to remediate, et cetera, so what are the unique things on an internal pen test that you think
Yep.
people should be doing prior to the engagement?
Yeah, some of the unique things for an internal Active Directory environment is one to audit Active Directory permissions
Hmm.
and specifically look for where tier 0 resources are misconfigured. And what I mean by that is look at all of your tier 0 resources. So your domain admins group, your domain admin users,
Hmm.
enterprise admins, anything with admin in the name, any of the tier 0 security groups, your domain controllers. I would, if I were about to do a pen test, I would look at all those groups and all those permissions and look for ones that where low privilege resource or low privilege users might have elevated rights to control those objects in Active Directory. So this is like use case number one that I see on internal pen tests is
Yeah.
we'll fire up our tools, we'll go and we'll look at, the root of the domain and everyone has full control. It's just like sitting out there and it's obvious to us because we know what to look for.
Yeah.
But those are the things that could be identified without us, right? You can
Yep.
go into Active Directory, right click and go to the security tab and you can see it. It's not super difficult in terms of like how to find it. It's just that these things kind of exist and there's not a good way to identify them. You're not alerted about them. So that would be number one that I do that I would do that's unique to internals is look at AD, look at your permissions. And the other one is still around like administrative access and administrative accounts. The other thing I would really focus on is your admin accounts,
Hmm.
and particularly if end users have local admin rights. That's something that can be, disastrously bad. Is if domain users or just everybody has local admin rights on their workstations. So those are the two things I would kind of focus on that's specific to internals before you do an internal pen test.
And in a lot of cases, and also, by the way, have you looked at your file shares? Have you just taken a cursory look by doing a basic word search?
Yep.
Those are the kind of things, because in most cases, if you take those three things that we just talked about, Active Directory permissions, administrative access, and file shares, the reason that you are DA by 9 a.m. on Monday in most cases is one of those three things,
Yep.
right? And it's almost always low hanging fruit. It's almost always a simple thing that anybody can figure out on their end. And
Yep.
so don't get me wrong, like it's super cool, man. I love bragging that you get friggin' DA like every week because of these things. But you're chasing that and not a more advanced attack path, right?
Yep.
And so the value there is like, hey guys, you just paid me, X number of thousands of dollars, and I did the search for password on your file share, and now I'm a domain administrator. So like,
Yep.
are you really getting value there? Debatable. So I do think that little bit of due diligence goes a long way.
Yep. So what about web apps, Brad? You live in the
Yeah,
web
man.
app world,
Yeah.
resident web app extraordinaire. What should people do before they have a web app pen test?
Burp Suite costs $350, and it does an excellent job at doing vulnerability scanning, right? And you need very little expertise. In fact, one of our clients asked me to help them set up their burp environment so they could scan their own stuff, and
Yep.
it was a 30-minute meeting. and now they're off doing vulnerability scanning. So like you can do that for a very low cost. There are other tools out there. Retire.js is one of them. You can look at Nikto, which is okay-ish. But there are some basic things you can do on your own to find those high level vulnerabilities. But more important than that, right? The time to think about application security is not when it is in production, public facing, and suddenly it's like, wow, we should get a pen test, and we've never thought about security until now. But that's what happens. And so, security has to be in the process from the start to finish. So if you are
Yep.
in a CI/CD environment, if you're in an agile development shop, and your only security check is a pen test, you're going to have a bad day, a real bad day. And so, yeah, man, you've got mentioned, you mentioned in here that there's no testing or stage environment. That is a absolute full stop requirement for web app pen testing. We will not pen test in production. The last time we did that was it was catastrophic, right?
Yep.
And so so make sure you have a staging or a test environment, some kind of non-production environment that we can access,
Yep.
and just do the work, man, up front. And so if you've got the expertise to write code, you've got the expertise to audit code, whether that be static or dynamic, however you want to do it, I don't care. But here's the other thing. This is something we run into a lot. Somebody will hire us to do a pen test on a proprietary app that's end of life. The company went out of business 35 years ago, and it's running on NT 4.0. And it's like, we want to know what the risk is of this application. I'm like, the whole thing is a risk, right? All of it.
We could tell you without testing it.
Yeah, I don't even, and we're actually working with a client right now who's like, hey, we have this end of life app and it's going to be around for a couple of years. We want to know what the risk is. And I'm like, cool, what are you planning to do about it? And so yeah, you got to have a remediation path.
Yep.
Finding this stuff is not going to do any good otherwise. So that's really it, right? Is you should have your own security processes. When you look at integrating security into the development process, pen testing is the last thing you do, and it's the most infrequent thing that you do because it's expensive and it takes time and it slows stuff down. So you need to be defining, security requirements are not a separate item from business requirements.
Mm-hmm.
Security is a requirement of business if you're building applications. And then, then of course, DAS, SaaS, and you work through the life cycle. The clients of ours that do a good job of this get a very short pen test report, right?
Yep.
And so, we're mainly at that point, we're focused on business logic flaws, chaining small vulnerabilities together to make an exploit path, things that it takes a human being to do. But you don't need to only do that. So yeah, I could beat that horse to death. But at the end of the day, if your whole security plan is to have Brad come pen test your web app, your plan is wrong.
Yep.
Right. So
yeah, no, you nailed it, and you segue nicely into some of the other topics that we wanted to talk about to kind of like round out this episode or wrap it up. Is that couple bullet points on when does it make sense to do a pen test and how to choose the right assessment. You already mentioned like mapping to business goals. Do you want to improve? Where are you in the maturity, life cycle when it comes to security? Are you kind of just starting out on the path, or are you, very sophisticated? You've got very good detection response, and you really do want that red team threat emulation type of assessment, right? You have to kind of evaluate where you're at, what your maturity level is, and what your goals are, business goals and security program goals, in order to identify what type of security assessment is going to be the right one for you at this given moment. And then, when a pen test makes sense once you've gone through a lot of this low-hanging fruit, right?
Yep.
All the things that we said earlier about asset inventory and asset management and vulnerability management, all of those things, once you get to that stage, I think I think you'll naturally kind of understand where you're at that point, or at least most folks I venture to guess would. Like if you've done an asset inventory, vulnerability management, I think when you're there and when you're ready for that pen test.
I agree.
And the times that we run into issues is when a client doesn't know that there are other things that they should do first. And then once they know, they're like, oh yeah, I should probably do that first because of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, and sometimes a pen test will uncover the lack of a security program element or particular process, and that's cool, but we don't get that deep visibility into your internal processes. And that's why other assessments may be a better fit for you, right? We had a client, I think it was last week, where we got on the phone with them and we're like, bro, you don't need an internal pen test.
Yep.
We need to kick you over the fence to the information security officer group and let them do a cloud assessment in your environment. That's what you need. And so, and of course, usually, they're happy, like, oh, okay, cool, that's what we'll do. And so I think you've got a good list here of things that you could do instead of a
Yep.
penetration test to just get the most bang for your buck and the value that you want to get if your goal is to improve yourself.
Yep.
So yeah, the foundational assessments, I'll jump into that if that's okay. I'm not skipping
Yeah.
too far ahead, am I?
No, good.
And so yeah, man, you've got listed here an IT security assessment. That's an outstanding place to start. Our company offers something called a 360 assessment that goes way beyond an IT security assessment. It's more of a holistic program overview. And so, to make sure you have the key elements in place, right? When we find an 8-character lowercase password on a pen test, we're like, yo, what is your password policy? And if it's different than your password policy, now you have an implementation problem. But so we can identify some of that. But you can also identify that through these assessments, right? And having somebody with a lot of experience review what your current policies and procedures are and
Yep.
identify gaps that will ultimately downstream lead to a bad penetration test. So
Yeah, another example is change control. In our 360
Dude.
assessment, even the IT security assessment, we'll look at kind of change control processes
Yep.
to see, like, when you decommission a server, how does that process work? Or when users are, termed, right? When a user leaves the organization,
Yep.
what's the process for handling their account, their workstation, or their computer, their data, etc. Because many times we'll do a pen test, especially internally with file shares, like you were mentioning earlier, or SharePoint. We'll do a pen test and we'll find remnants of things that were left over from, XYZ admin or some user, or
Yep.
we could tell that it was a remnant of some poorly implemented change control process. So
Yep.
A really good example of this is we did an internal pen test, and I found a VMDK, a live VMDK of a domain controller on a file share.
Beautiful.
And the IT department had a process set up to temporarily create a backup of this virtual machine, right? The domain controller virtual machine, and back it up to a file share. But they didn't go through the process of removing it after they were done. Change control, right? That to me is change control 101 of, like, we're doing this thing temporarily. It's documented. We do this thing, but they didn't follow the last step, which was like the cleanup and making sure that they followed through.
Yep.
So that to me is very much a change control thing. And those things can be identified in those more risk-based type of assessments.
Yeah, I agree. And then once you get through that process, right? What should you do next? I think everybody should start with an external pen test. I think an external pen test should be an annual occurrence, if not biannual, depending on the rate at which your environment changes, right? If you're a relatively large organization with a very fluid tech stack, twice a year is probably better for you. But most folks can get away with a single annual external pen test just to get started in that process and use that to validate your existing controls.
Yep.
I think we see a lot of clients that do internal pen testing too soon. What I mean by that is they do not have these assessments and they do not have controls. And so when we ask them, like, how are you guys planning on responding to, let's say a security alert is generated, right? And it's like, oh, well, we work 9 to 5, but we monitor our own. And I'm like, all right, cool. So as long as we hack you at 5:50, we should be, good, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, just make sure that you're relatively squared away for that. And then I think an internal pen test is the logical next step, right? So you've done your external, you've done that remediation, you've bridged any gaps in controls and process. The inside's always going to be worse than the outside. Right? The internal pen test, it's going to hurt the first time you do it. It's going to hurt real bad.
Yeah.
But then you can do that for a year or two and make sure your internal environment's squared away, right? And that's when we start getting into a more of a maturity model where we're stepping up into some of the more advanced things. So I've done my internal, I've done my external. What do I do next, right? I'm continuing to work on my processes, doing assessments. What's after that?
Yeah, I'm a big believer too in doing internal, external on a regular basis. Beyond that, purple teams are a good exercise as well.
Yeah.
They're kind of, our internal pen test is assume breach. It's more closer to a red team than a network pen test, right? Like it's more closer to a red team than it would be like an external network pen test. Um, so purple team is a great intermediary between doing an internal pen test and doing like a full blown red team, right? Because for a red team, if you don't have a handle on your threat detection and your response, the red team is going to be pretty tough, right?
Yeah.
That's the goal of the red team, is to test the response just as much as it is to like find a way to whatever it is, you know, that you gave as a goal. So purple teams are great for, you know, I talk about them in terms of unit testing. It's, to me, it's unit testing your detection, your threat detection. So can we detect all the different ways that we could enumerate the domain admins group? Can we detect the various ways that we can perform curb roasting? Can we detect, you know, the various methods for lateral movement in your environment, right? Because we could use RDP, we could use PS remoting, we could use all these, you know, various different things to perform lateral movement. Can we detect them? You know, and what are the ones we cannot? So that purple team is designed to answer those questions. Whereas, you know, we do some of that in the internal, we document that stuff, we provide a detailed section in the report for the high level things that we did, but it's not designed to be collaborative in that nature, whereas a purple team is, right? And it's a good intermediary between that internal pen test and like a full blown threat emulation red team type of assessment.
Yeah, completely agree. And there are some other nuanced types of assessments that you can do to kind of get deeper into individual aspects of your organization. So cloud security is obviously really big right now, and so you know we actually do at this company we do two different types of cloud assessments. One of them is a very like CIS checklist, you know, oriented, which you should do first, and then you know the other one is an actual cloud pen test, right? Where it's a similar assume breach style, where we're going to get a compromised user or a compromised application, and then see how far we can move in that environment laterally and privilege escalation. So, but that's an advanced thing, right? That's not where you should start. This is something once you've got everything else squared away, we can look into. You know, and then once you get to that level of maturity, we're done, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I would just go home, like take a
Just
nap.
don't worry about security anymore.
It's
Or is
solved.
this a life cycle that we have to continuously work through,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. It very much is a life cycle. It's a living and breathing thing.
Yeah.
Things change, technology changes, people change. It's, you know, it's very much we're biased in saying that because it benefits us. But truthfully, even if, you know, I was still in my old job, I would tell you it is very much a life cycle thing. And I think that resonates with everybody listening, probably. I think that's not a hard thing to like understand, that this is something that is not one and done.
Yeah, I completely agree. And if it's not evident already, you know, we send as many people away that don't need a pen test because we get on the phone with them and we're like, bro, you're not ready, or this isn't what you need. So we're not really, you know, chasing that like, oh, you need to do all this business with us. It's really like, dude, what do you
Yep.
actually need at this step
Yep.
in your maturity journey that's going to benefit you the most? You know,
Yep.
and sometimes us coming in and kicking over a bunch of stuff
Yep.
is not what you need. So
Yeah, and ultimately, I think it's you know, if we have conversations with the client and they share information about their environment, they're like, actually, I don't think you need this. I think there's a lot of respect earned and developed there, and a relationship developed there to say like, hey, I don't think you need this because of X, Y, and Z.
yeah,
I think there's a certain level of trust and kind of transparency there that people like and people look for. And I think it's ultimately a good thing for clients and for us to not do things that are a waste of time, that are just going to burn your money and burn your time and resources. Let's focus on the things that actually provide value. And so that's what we try to do.
Yeah, it is. And I think we have this like internal mantra, which is like, just do the right thing, right? If that means that we don't get anything out of it, so be it. But doing the right thing is never the wrong answer. And so that's kind of the same approach that we're taking here. All right, folks, we are 45 minutes in at this point. So that's all we have time for today. We went a little long, but I think it was worth it. We really appreciate you guys listening or watching. Yeah, feel free to share this with your folks. We really appreciate it. And we'll check you guys out next week.